Christ.
The gospel is about the commandment to forgive, not 7 times, but 77 times. Today, my dear brothers and sisters, allow me to share a few words about the very famous woman, a very saintly woman whose memory we remember today, Saint Clare of Assisi, a disciple of Francis, founder of the Poor Clares, whose first convent at Assisi in Italy, Clare directed as abbess for 42 years. The beginning of Clare's religious life is a good movie material. Clare came from a wealthy family. Her father was Faberone of Reduccio. Her mother was Ortolana di Fiumi. Clare had a younger sister named Agnes and another sister named Beatrice. But of Clare's childhood, Clare's adolescence and home life, there are no certain facts except probably what is known is that Clare refused to get married at the age of 15, and she was moved by the dynamic preaching of St. Francis, who became Clare's lifelong friend, spiritual advisor, and spiritual guide. At the age of 18, Clare escaped one evening from her father's house. She was met on the road by friars carrying torches, and in the poor little chapel of Porciuncula, Clare received a woolen habit. She exchanged her bejeweled belt for a common rope with knots in it. Clare also sacrificed her long hair to the Caesars of Francis. She was placed in a Benedictine convent, which her father and uncles stormed in anger. But Clare clung to the altar of the church, and she remained adamant to leave the convent. Some 16 days later, her sister Agnes joined Clare in the convent. And there is even an account that says that even her mother entered the convent. Other young women followed. These women live a life of poverty, a life of austerity, a life of complete seclusion from the world, according to a rule Francis gave the group as the second order, the Poor Clares. And at the age of 21, Francis obliged Clare, under obedience, to accept the office of abbess, the superior of the local community, in which Clare continued until her death. Clare became the mother and foundress of the Franciscan Second Order, called the Poor Clares, and she was the superior of the congregation for at least 40 to 42 years. The nuns of Poor Clares originally went barefoot. The nuns of Poor Clares originally slept on the ground. They ate no meat. They observed perpetual abstinence from meat. They observed almost complete silence. They never spoke except when they were obliged by necessity and charity. The nuns of Poor Clares had no stockings. They did not wear any shoes, no sandals, or any covering on their feet. But later on, Clare, like Francis, persuaded the sisters to moderate the rigor, because according to them, our bodies are not made of steel. My dear brothers and sisters, the sisters wanted to highlight gospel poverty in their community life. That is why they possessed no property, whether individually or in common, and they subsisted only on daily contributions and donations from the faithful. Contemporary accounts glow with admiration of Clare's life inside the convent. Clare also served the sick. She waited on table. She washed the feet of the begging nuns. She came from prayer, and it was said, with her face shining, it dazzled the sisters around her. And then she suffered from a serious illness for the last 27 years of her life. Twice during her illness, she was visited by the Holy Father, by the Pope then, Pope Innocent IV, who gave Clare the absolution. And the influence of Clare was such that popes and cardinals, bishops and priests and religious often came to console Clare. And interestingly, Clare never left their convent at San Damiano. My dear friends, Francis had always been Clare's great friend and inspiration. The life of Clare was a scenario of sanctity, a scenario of courageous resistance to the ever-pressure to dilute the ideal, a passion for poverty and humility, a passion for an ardent life of prayer, and a genuine concern for her fellow sisters. I happened to read a homily by Pope John Paul II in 1982 when he visited the proto-monastery of Assisi. And in his homily, Pope John Paul II noted that Francis and Clare are two inseparable legends. He said, and I quote, "It is difficult to separate these two names, Francis and Clare, because they are joined by something very profound that cannot be understood outside the criteria of Franciscan Christian gospel spirituality, and certainly not by pure human criteria. The dual names of Francis and Clare make sense only in terms of Christian, spiritual, and heavenly categories. But it is also a reality of this earth, of this city, and of this church. After a life of remarkable self-discipline, a life of holiness and poverty, Clare died in 1253 at the age of 60, and she was canonized by Pope Alexander IV merely 2 years after her death. Amen.